So when I went to see Dick, when it came out, it must have been a while ago, I left a book. I was so enthralled. I left a book in the theater, and the book was, if you're a real Nixon buff, you'll know, it was Jerry Voorhees' book. Do you know that? He's the guy who Nixon beat for his first congressional race.
Oh, okay. I thought he was the bad guy from Friday the 13th.
No. He was like this very upright Boy Scout type liberal congressman that Nixon red baited out of office. You
were so taken with the world's foremost Nixon dramatization that you left your book behind.
Exactly, my Nixon book.
Speaking of Woodward, of the
yes,
of the Trump news,
yes,
and obviously, you're not in a position where you necessarily have to hold information. I assume that you've never really had to.
I can't hold anything. That's why, working on with Hollywood, I really need to learn what the rules are.
Well, also because you're writing about stuff that's 40 years and older, so there's not a lot of super current events that you have to wait for your book to be published.
Yeah, I mean, there's stuff within the book that's could be perceived as hot. No one has seemed to have noticed that I had caught Ronald Reagan in a pretty nasty quid pro quo in 1978 or 1979. I've gotten to the point where I've done so many interviews. I'm kind of like I kind of feel like I'm trolling the interviewers just to test their knowledge of the book. There's a chunk where there's a letter that was published in a book of Reagan letters. And I'm like, what the hell is this? And it's a letter to the president of Mexico, and it's basically like, I do know the head of Northrop Aircraft, and if you make this aircraft order, it would be really great. and I just kind of looked it up, and it turns out that the head of this corporation has a long history of very shady donations to politicians in exchange for political favors. So I think I kind of nailed Reagan dead to rights on this one, and I was just like, wow, maybe I should do an op-ed on this. It's kind of, but I actually love to, the process is obviously very long. And during a lot of these years, I've had various sort of jobs where I've been kind of blogging, like for The Nation, or I had a weekly column for Rolling Stone Online. So I'm always kind of doing these kind of notebook dump style essays. Like I did a big one on that you might be interested in the Washington Spectator, where I had a monthly column on Star Wars and kind of a turn towards the infantilization of popular culture.
Oh, Star Wars, the movie series, not the
not the. So I'm out. I'm always scooping myself. I can't. I can't help it. I just love to show people what I found.
What's really funny about that specific example is that is a very. I mean, the way you phrase it is a very Trumpian way of putting it, too, of just like, hey, I may have this thing that you saying it without exactly saying it.
Yeah, and Reagan is not supposed to be that kind of guy.
So the Woodward thing, I saw his justification. And
I'm disgusted. I'm completely disgusted. I think it's completely inexcusable. And one of the things I find most disturbing is, I did a tweet, basically like how dare he, not reporting what he knows in a timely fashion. And I've been kind of disgusted at the response of people just kind of like gaming this out. Like, oh, well, maybe he thought that it would help more in September, or, well, we didn't really know what we know now. And I find that really telling of the public mind right now, that everyone, I kind of dream of doing this book about how everyone in America has turned into what used to be called a flack, a public relations professional, or a pundit, right? And everyone is savvy, right? Moral questions, political questions are all evaluated on this axis of personal advantage, and the fact that polling culture has become so dominant in political discussions, and people are thinking about like the third order derivative about a decision made by a politician will have in the 12-dimensional chess game. Whereas I've been watching A French Village, right, the show about the French Resistance, and it's basically about these decisions you have to make in real time, in which you're basically faced with two impossible situations of, saving lives or or accommodating.
Part of what's interesting about Woodward's response is I think he did frame it in a way that was tied to the timing of the election, which, like, at the end of the day, I don't know that's
not his job. And I'm not Mr. like objective journalism. I think that advocacy journalism is, just fine, but there are just certain very basic moral lines that have to be drawn in my eyes. And I've never liked that guy. I wasn't around, when he was, making his reputation. I was born in 1969. But I once wrote a review of one of his George Bush books. There were 3 of them. And one of the things I discovered and reported on and was quite censorious of in the review was that I think I compared like the second book or the first one to the third one, and his depiction of George W. Bush was completely different. One of them was heroic, and then it got less and less heroic. And as the public opinion towards him shifted, and the real smoking gun, to use the Watergate metaphor, was that he actually reported the same interview, the same Oval Office interview with George W. Bush, and included language in the last book that was damning, that was not in his reporting the same interview in the first book. Basically, that in the first book, it was George Bush saying we had enough information about weapons of mass destruction to justify this, and then in the third book, Woodward says it took him 6 minutes to try to even defend himself, after I asked him about it, the definitive piece about that, about how Woodward does business was by Joan Gideon in the New York Review of Books many years ago. And she called it, political pornography, right? Political, sort of like this kind of spectacle where you get to kind of peek behind the wall at, powerful people doing powerful things. And yeah, I think he long ago ceased to serve a useful civic function. I'm very moralistic when it comes to this stuff.
Michael Wolff was kind of the next logical step of that, right? I mean, that was really at least at the time, that was kind of the ultimate political pornography of the Trump era when Fire and Fury came out.
Right. And, a lot of the kind of books I write about, presidents, a lot of it, partakes of that kind of pornography of power, like, fly on the wall, kind of scenes of how the sausage gets made. And, that really doesn't hold much appeal for me. Not my problem. It's not my issue.
I suspect it's a hard line to walk, though, because obviously, you are an entertaining writer and you are doing
I don't mind entertaining.
Yeah, but you are doing your best to keep people, engaged over a 900-page book.
I think there's other ways to entertain than, putting words in people's mouths and, creating little dramatic miniatures, about, what goes on in the Oval Office.
I do suspect that specific instance is a case of, 9/11 just kind of broke our collective brains.
Oh, yeah, totally. I don't think we've come to terms yet with my wife and I talk about this a lot. We were both in New York, and my wife was working downtown. She wasn't there when it happened. She was at a gym, I think. But, I knew people who survived the building. And I've written a lot about this, actually, when I was in Blogger at the Nation, about how America kind of surrendered to a culture of fear. I compared how when Eisenhower had Khrushchev as a guest of state, and, he went to Disneyland and got a state dinner, and compared that to when Ahmadinejad went to speak at the UN, and it was like treated like America's national security was, everyone just kind of curled up in a little ball. I even talked about like the example of the woman maybe 5 or 6 years ago who smashed her car into the White House gate, and like next thing you know, like 80 officers are at her apartment in hazmat suits, and it's clearly this is like disturbed mentally ill woman. And I say when a guy, climbed over the White House wall in 1975, it was like a one-day story,
It certainly feels like there are multiple unprecedented things happening on a daily basis, such to a point that somebody will mention something to me from, a month or two ago, or the 2016 campaign. And it's totally, like
I didn't remember Michael Wolff. I was like, who's Michael Wolff again?
the thing I point to a lot is do you remember in the 2016 campaign when Trump tweeted a picture of Hillary with the Star of David.
I do, yeah.
It was a sheriff star. It was a big deal for about a day, and I had to be reminded of it.
Yeah.
Something that I ask people who were around for Nixon is how unprecedented the current moment feels. And two, one, all of them who really lived through it tell me that this moment does feel different. But, you know, as somebody who's been steeped in up to and including, you know, that period of time, is it really that different? Is it just the way that things are framed?
Different is, you know, every period is different. And, you know, we tend to, like, the way historical memory works and is represented tends to be very schematic. People will be like, is this 1968? Is this 1972? Is this, you know, whatever, you know, and a lot of times, you know, like, well, they can't be both, you know. You know, the Saturday Night Massacre was genuinely terrifying, right? I mean, the idea that, you know, men with guns were, you know, keeping lawyers away from their offices, you know. I mean, it really, the word fascism was, and then, you know, while that was happening, you know, Henry Kissinger is announcing, you know, an increase in America's alert level, you know, and there's like a war going on in Israel, and that was a very, you know, frightening juncture. But at the same time, I think something that must have felt very different was that there was some reasonable sense at that time that there were grown-ups who were in charge. And I'm not so sure that, you know, that was an entirely a healthy reaction. You know, somehow like the, you know, kind of Walter Cronkite and Sam Ervin were going to kind of save us from, you know, the teeming masses. But the idea of the entire Republican Party rushing beneath the banner of an authoritarian fascist, you know, and serving as his mob lawyers, that would have been very unusual. There was one guy on the Watergate committee who basically, Ed Gurney, who sounded like a Fox News commentator, right? Compare that to, you know, the Intelligence Committee, which was like the greatest bastion. It was created as a bastion of bipartisanship, this kind of completely apolitical body that was meant to oversee the intelligence agencies after the Church Committee revealed that, you know, the CIA was, you know, assassinating foreign leaders, you know, and to see what happened to that, you know, during the investigations of Donald Trump. And the Republicans just completely sounding like, you know, spouting off like John Birch Society style nonsense, you know, every time they had the microphone, night and day really compared to Nixon.
Buckley was around. I mean, there were some of those sort of relatively fringy.
Yeah, well, the Buckley thing is really interesting because even though in a lot of my work and a lot of other historians' works, we've been kind of tearing down the paradigm that somehow Buckley represented this kind of hard and fast wall, you know, had set up this hard and fast wall between mainstream and extreme conservatives, right? By talking about how permeable that was and how they used each other, and, you know, the extremism of National Review. I mean, if you read what it wrote about, you know, African decolonialization, it was, you know, it was as racist as any Klan publication, basically. But at the same time, the ideological role William Buckley played in the conservative movement was to present this respectable face. And he played that role very well. And he did have this disciplining power, you know, and I would give the example of Rush Limbaugh, who I listened to and have listened to a lot ever since he went national. And William Buckley was the only person he spoke about deferentially. He'd call him Mr. Buckley. And when William F. Buckley died, it was like 2010. And it can't completely be an accident that it was almost immediately afterward that the Tea Party became much more feral, you know, than previous, you know, conservative mass movements and mass spokesmen. And Rush Limbaugh became just much more willing to troll the most feverish of swamps. And I can easily imagine a William F. Buckley, you know, after he, you know, say called Chelsea Clinton an ugly dog or something like that, calling him and saying, look, optics are important. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about optics, right? I mean, what's going on underneath the lid, you know, is just as cockroachy, you know. But there was a sense pre-Trump that there's certain things you might believe, but you don't say.
Buckley played a similar adult in the room position.
Right. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm struggling right now to think of somebody who might have filled that vacuum to some degree.
I mean, I guess for like the people who were kind of like sitting in the editorial suites and the production, offices of the networks, I think John McCain probably. Anyone who tried that, has basically been purged, disappeared, like Jeff Flake.
McCain is kind of the perfect example from the standpoint of it. There was a real shift in the power dynamic when Trump is able to go out there and joke about him being a bad pilot, right? I mean, right. That represents just a total almost exactly a total change in power.
And the basic dynamic, as I put it, is since Goldwater left the Republican Party as a bloody pulpy mess on the floor in 1964, so much of conservative politics has been about kind of hiding your hand and coming up with, basically a way of speaking that is that distracts from the ultimate policy aims, right? Which have never been particularly popular. What Trumpism is about is, lowering that wall, right? It's the dog whistle become the train whistle. It's, George W. Bush is Islam is a religion of peace. Donald Trump is they're sending their rapists. And, as we've seen, to anyone who, pays close attention to, what's going on in the, deregulation, the aim is the same fundamentally. The policies are similar to what any conservative would try and pursue. The personnel is absolutely, it's like I was just reading an article about in Vanity Fair, a big article that came out a few years ago, and it was this head scratching article about whatever happened to Robert Barr. Why is he working for Trump in the first place? He's such a respectable guy, and he doesn't need to do this. And in fact, he turns out to be the quintessential Republican who was just biding his opportunity to put down the lesser breeds all the time. And now that he has this opportunity to like basically have his king, he's become the keeper of the king's chamber pot with alacrity, and clearly, that's what he was going for all the time. And if it meant, sounding like a respectable grown up, upholding the institutions of the Justice Department under George W. Bush, that was fine, right? But once he had an opportunity to, completely rip those norms to shreds, he had no compunctions about doing it. That's a feature, not a bug. And the fact that like the establishment was like thought he was one of them, tells more on the establishment than it does on Bob Barr.
Something I keep coming back to about the current moment is that the majority of the criticisms I see leveled against Trump right now are about, about discourse, are about the things that he says, where
even his big supporters are like, oh, I don't like how he tweets. Yeah, I wish he was more polite.
There's a reason why, every basically Republican senator, I mean, even Flake to some degree, I think, was voted pretty closely along the lines of Trump's policies. Yeah, I reviewed
Flake's memoir, and basically his complaint about Trump on immigration is that we had a pretty good deal going when we basically let cheap labor go back and forth across the border whenever we wanted to exploit. I mean, he always says that, and there's all kinds of things he says in the book that are downright sadistic, but it's a different brand of conservatism.
Do you get the sense that being steeped in history for so long, writing about this so much and writing specifically about the conservative movement has made your own political stance a little more pragmatic, of just sort of having the kind of the larger historical context of things? Precedent is maybe a good way of framing it, of you kind of recognizing that, like, yeah, maybe the some of the language has changed, and obviously, the media landscape has changed, but if you pan the camera back a bit, that maybe this moment isn't entirely unprecedented. Does it make you maybe a little bit more moderate than you might be otherwise?
No, not at all. I think that understanding this history inside and out, I think it's made me grasp the extent to which movement conservatism is kind of a Leninist formation that's aimed at, undoing everything that's good, decent, and true in the American experiment. and has made me, all the more impassioned to defeat it. So I mean, in that sense, I become more immoderate. But I think that what you seem to be getting at is maybe I do have a little bit of this too shall pass. I'm pretty good at calming people down. I could say, at least, 1 million Americans aren't, killing each other in battles like, in the 1860s, right? But at the same time, I see those kinds of energies and divisions that, led to, almost 1 million Americans killing each other as pretty much structural features of the American constitutional order. Maybe I've become a little more zen about, what Antonio Gramsci, the Marxist a writer and philosopher from Italy in the early 20th century, called pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Pessimism of the intellect basically means, just actually being astringent, steely-eyed, not flinching at looking at the facts and following them wherever they take you, even if they're uncomfortable. And optimism of the will means understanding that human history changes. Human beings create history. We're not just victims of it. And seeing myself as a citizen among citizens, and believing in political activism, and believing that understanding how American history has worked and human history has worked means lots of very unlikely radical changes, happen, are made to happen, like emancipation, like the New Deal, like the Civil Rights Act, that things that seemed inevitable seemed anything but, on the cusp of their achievement.
Activism is an interesting word, and it does sort of get back to that Woodward thing a little bit of the role that he played, and again this three-dimensional chess. Do you consider yourself to be an activist, and is
Yes.
your writing in any way activism?
I don't have a good answer about whether all my writing is activism. Some of my writing is absolutely activism. I mean, for example, in Chicago, in my hometown, in 2014, when Rahm Emanuel was running for re-election against a progressive candidate, I wrote tons of articles for Indies Times Magazine about Rahm Emanuel's wickedness, and I'm on the board of Indies Times Magazine now. I'm becoming president of the board next year, and that's an activist magazine that basically sees itself as an organ for social justice movements, right? Writing history, I've never had any trouble telling the story. I want to tell it without really thinking about how it will move readers one way or another in terms of what kind of action they take after reading it. And I don't really have a good answer for where the distinction is. The fact that people trust me as a writer, I think, is just attests to the possibility that I've gotten the balance okay.
I do get the sense, obviously, these 4 books have taken a large chunk out of your life to write.
23 years.
So, yeah, nearly a quarter of a century to write. That perhaps the ways in which you address the conservative movement have changed, and
Yes.
that you have become more, I don't know if emboldened is necessarily, maybe emboldened is the right word.
Maybe I've just understand it better. Maybe I've come closer to the truth, right? I mean, if my work is less flattering to conservatives than it was when I first started doing it in 1997 in my first book, where I frequently took conservatives that I was interviewing at their word about what was going on. Maybe it's just because I've winnowed away distortions and, come closer to the way it actually was. Maybe I've gotten better at it.
You didn't get a sense that early on, as you were kind of testing the waters for this, that you were more concerned about how the conservative movement would react to such a book?
I have always been gifted with the ability not to care much what people thought of what I wrote, which is pretty remarkable because I'm not, I'm in some ways I can be quite thin-skinned. I certainly care what, my dad thought of my work, mainly that he didn't read it, that could, like send me into tailspins of despondency, so it's not like, I'm just like had this alligator hide, but, when conservatives read Before the Storm and praised it, that was great. But when, conservatives read Reaganland and consider me, Beelzebub, that doesn't really concern me either. When, radicals think that this is more like in the articles, right? So like, there's lots of contention going on the left right now among, basically what it means to be a radical and socialism and what it means to be in the professional managerial class and the working class. And there's lots of ideological debates that I'm part of. And when, I'm considered a neoliberal shill, Democratic Party hack, as Glenn Greenwald called me, that doesn't particularly concern me either. I enjoy the fight. I don't take it too seriously. I don't think what intellectuals do is all that important ultimately. So no, for whatever reason, I just am able to write through it all and tell the truth as I see it without fear or favor, hopefully. And I'm really grateful that I don't dwell on that kind of stuff.
Your parents are conservative.
They're gone now. They were conservative growing up. They weren't like ideologues or anything like that. They were very strong kind of right-wing Zionists. My dad was a small businessman who deeply resented, federal intrusions into his prerogatives. He was, I think, held his working class employees into a bit of contempt and fear. He kept a gun in his desk. And I grew up in a very racist city in which the kind of I had to learn that Jews were liberals by reading books about it. But my dad always told me that I would abandon these left-wing views once I had to meet a payroll. And when my dad retired and didn't have to make a payroll anymore, in fact, he became an aficionado of MSNBC and hated George Bush. So we were much more on the same page by the time he left us several years ago.
What happened to you?
What happened to me?
Politically. How did you veer so far left with conservative parents?
I think the big issue, a lot of the matrix for this was, in fact, like synagogue. And I think that very early on, I decided that people in my parents' circle and the temple we belonged to were hypocrites, which is kind of a puerile kind of political category, right? It's kind of
sure. Also like adolescence.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that was the spark that's where I kind of began to hone kind of a critical temper, the hypocrisy of, making their kids go to Sunday school, but, not really having any religious practice themselves. That's silly, whoever. I get that now, why a parent would want to do that. But certainly, the first political issue that made me mad was the kind of jingoistic veneration around Israeli militarism. Right? Like my dad would make Israeli tanks and plane models. He would hang like F-15s, Israeli F-15s from the ceiling of his bedroom. I found it very easy to not identify with that. And I came up with Reagan as president, and I knew I didn't like him. I certainly, I'm a jazz musician, so I think that I identified with African American culture, and it's hard to do that without kind of thinking about things like racism and repression and white supremacy. Once that original sort of moral stake is kind of driven into the ground, and that's your foundation, then, you develop an identity from there on out. And, I can just remember sitting around in high school and during my free period in the library, reading The Nation, reading The New Republic, finding the radical books that were in the high school library. There was one about, there was this far left book I remember reading called The Anti-Communist Imperative, in which it was just, now I realize it was kind of this Chomskyan kind of critique of American foreign policy as, you know, a form of imperialism, you know. And I was like, oh, interesting.
A little anarchist, perhaps.
Yeah. And so, you know, like a lot of people growing up, I didn't really respect my parents and didn't see the world the same way that, you know, they did.
Yeah.
And, you know, went from there.
Is there any way in which, I mean, you know, like we've obviously sort of charted your kind of continued left progression through the process of writing this, or at least further disillusionment with the conservative movement. But is there any way in which steeping yourself in this for so long was able to make you maybe a little bit more empathetic with your parents' positions growing up?
Well, I'm empathetic with conservatives, right? I mean, I couldn't do what I did unless I did some very hard intellectual and psychic work, you know, trying to figure out where they're coming from, right? I mean, I'm a liberal after all. That's what we do, you know, at our best, you know. So, yeah, I mean, I can certainly see why my dad would be, you know, want to run his business, you know, without interference. I certainly can see why there was class conflict between him and his workers, right? You know, I can think about, you know, why people who, you know, retreated behind their white picket fences in the suburbs might see that as a logical thing to do, right? I mean, as far as, you know, kind of empathy with my parents, I mean, that's just part of the strange wisdom of, you know, kind of growing up, you know. I mean, I realized, you know, by the time my mom died that they were free spirits in a lot of ways, you know, in a way that I didn't quite appreciate, you know, as a typical kind of suburban kid who, you know, thought of the suburbs as, you know, this prison of conformity.
You also don't associate the term free spirit with the conservative movement all that much, generally.
Well, actually, you know, I mean, look at a figure like Barry Goldwater. I mean, Barry Goldwater was absolutely, you know, a free spirit. You know, I mean, he was a free spirit that exercised it by, you know, flying his private plane all over Arizona, you know, and a kid who never had to carry cash when he was a kid because he had, you know, his family had, you know, accounts in every store because he was basically like a little aristocrat in Phoenix. But a big part of the appeal, and that's one of the themes of my first book, a big part of the appeal of conservatism in the Goldwater era, and also with Reagan too, was to young people, right? And that conscience of a conservative, you know, the reason it became so popular among college students, the same college students who, you know, might be attracted to Catcher in the Rye, say, was that it was a critique of bureaucratic conformity. You know, I mean, I might not agree with, you know, the alternative it posed, right? But the idea, the metaphors that Barry Goldwater used were very similar to the metaphors that someone like Mario Savio used. You know, throw yourself against the gears of the machine. You know, that kind of libertarian. You know, they want. You know, Barry Goldwater was very big on the idea that Social Security numbers were this kind of like force of regimentation. You know, which you can certainly see. You know, someone on the left. You know, kind of this. You know, sort of anarchist tending ideology, you know, identifying with. So, yeah, I mean, there are plenty of free spirits on the right. Yeah.
Are there any major figures in there that you came out feeling more of a sense of kinship with than you went into?
That's really interesting. Well, I was always very proud when people told me that they always just like saw Nixon as a villain, but they kind of empathized with him after reading Nixonland. And I wouldn't say I feel a sense of kinship with Richard Nixon, but the categories I use to kind of describe, you know, Nixon's mental map of the universe, like the Franklins and the Orthogonians, right, based on the social club he created because the cool kids wouldn't let him into their fraternity in college, right? I mean, I say we're all Franklins, we're all Orthogonians, right? I mean, certainly, you know, his grasp of his own sense of dispossession, you know, people who always, you know, kind of, you know, it's like it's like being in high school and hearing on Monday morning about the great party and you never heard about it on Friday, you know. So I mean, I can certainly, you know, feel a kinship with that. You know, if you can't feel a kinship with that, you know, then, you know, I don't know who you are.
The kinship with him is that he's he's very clearly a tragic figure. There's no,
well, that too.
Even though he rose to the ranks of the president of the
You
United
have to
States,
figure out a way to feel a kinship with people that you spend years with. It's like, I mean, Ronald Reagan, this, kind of lonely kid who, basically had to, like read books in order to come up with a narrative that made sense from this, incredibly chaotic family situation. Yeah. I mean, is there anyone on the right that I emerged thinking, oh, this guy is really a hero? I don't think so. I think I have enormous respect for a lot of them, for changing the world, for their, for the brilliance of which they did so. I think in this book, Phyllis Schlafly, unbelievably, brilliant person who, had enormous moral failings, but what she did, I say that, when Mrs. America came out and I was interviewed by the New York Times, I said she was the most effective political organizer in American history.
I heard you speaking about her recently, and I think you feel like she almost got a raw deal from like Gloria Steinem, or just historically in terms of the actual power.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate that Gloria Steinem and Eleanor Smeal, who are, obviously great heroes who've done more for human rights, in their life than I could ever dream of. By the way, if you read Gloria Steinem, who is an amazing journalist, who never got credit as one of the pioneers of the new journalism, if you read her book, her long article about going undercover as a Playboy bunny that came out in the early '60s. But I was referring to her interview with Patricia Nixon that came out in New York Magazine in 1968. It's just like masterful. And Pat Nixon and Gloria Steinem came from very, kind of humble beginnings and was a self-made intellectual in a lot of ways. But their insistence that the people who defeated the ERA were actually fronts for corporate interests and the insurance interests, there's like no evidence to support it. And I can understand why they would want to believe that's true, but it's not really feminist. It was actually women. It was actually women organizing themselves. And unless you grasp that there are left-wing people in the world and there are right-wing people in the world, and being born to a certain identity doesn't determine in advance what vision you're going to have of the universe, then you're not going to. It's not liberal. Ultimately, it's like that sort of empathy. That sort of possibility of understanding all different ways of being human is not something really conservatives do very well, but liberals should be able to do it at their best.
Do you think you could have written as effective of books if it was a political ideology that you were more aligned with? Like I ask that because I know
I don't think it would interest me as much.
This may or may not be a good parallel, but I know that part of the reason why you stopped when you did is because you didn't want to write a part of history that you lived through.
Right.
Is it a sense that like in either respect that you can't be too close to the subject?
Yeah. I mean, I think I've always likened my work to basically being an anthropologist of a foreign tribe of Americans. And that's where the pleasure kind of comes for me. I written about and for, liberals and leftists, but it just doesn't give me the same thrill. I've never really gotten to the bottom of, why that's the case and what would happen if I tried to write about a hero. I don't know. Maybe I just revealed they had feet of clay,
You write about Carter to some degree, he's...
Yeah. And I actually came away with not a little bit of contempt for him in a lot of ways.
How so?
Well, I think that his most powerful animating passion and ideology was austerity. The American people had to do more with less. And the fact that his answer to the crisis of inflation was that it was caused by budget deficits. And so, the government had to do less in order to cure inflation was tragic because it was false, right? I mean, there's a syllogism, inflation is caused by the government spending too much money, right? Well, now we have practically no inflation, right? In the last, 20 years, basically. And we have massive government deficits. So clearly that theory wasn't true. But holding to that theory and, the Federal Reserve Chairman that he appointed, Paul Volcker, holding to the theory that, we needed basically to induce misery in order to, slow down the economy, it was unnecessary, right? It was he caused unnecessary pain, and he's never atoned for that.
At what point was it clear that you had a 4-volume series on your hands?
I was much in the psychic state that you're in today.
How's that?
Well, it was terrifying. It was like, I was like, oh, I'll just, squeeze my way to November 1980 in the next, I mean, it was just clear that I had kudzu, it was like, with the Sorcerer's Apprentice, mm-hmm. and I had to kind of go to my agent and my publisher and say I couldn't fulfill my contract. And that was terrifying. That was a terrifying day. In fact, it happened the thing that happened like the day before that realization was I saw Argo, a wonderful movie about the rescue of the hostages who snuck into the Canadian embassy. You've seen it?
Yeah. The Ben Affleck.
Yeah. And I was like thinking about, I was nowhere near to like getting to that point in my research, and I was like, holy cow! I was in denial, and I was suddenly, I was flushed with the realization that this was not going to happen in the way I intended.
You're saying specifically that you set out to cover that long of a time span in a single book, and it was clear that you couldn't. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. 73 to 19. It was supposed to be a trilogy. Yeah. And the trilogy became a tetralogy.
Sure, but I guess the question I'm getting at was,
when did I think that I wanted to write 3 books? From the beginning.
That you wanted. Okay, yeah. You knew that you wanted to devote.
For some reason, I don't know how I conceptualized originally a trilogy that covered Goldwater through Reagan, and I don't know how that seemed obvious to me. My model was definitely Taylor Branch's Parting the Water series, America in the King years, and that seemed like the story I wanted to tell. And once that became my commitment, I really never had any doubts about it.
Having spent that much of your life focused on the series specifically, is there some like postpartum depression in having finished this?
Well, I have had postpartum depression after finishing books, Nixonland specifically, terrible depression. But
you knew in that case that there was another one coming.
Yes. But I think that was how is this book going to be received? Did I pull it off? But I'm in a place in my life and my career, knock wood, where, I just feel very confident about who I am and what I'm doing in my life. So, not this time. No, I'm ready to move on to my next adventure.
Do you have an idea? Did you have something on the back burner? Did you know what your next project was going to be?
Yeah, I've had a couple big projects that I've been kind of saving string for, and they all tend to be like super absorbing projects that, just kind of like absorb every intellectual and, kind of aesthetic fiber of my being. That's kind of how I do it. Well, I want to write a short book called The Republican Playbook, in which I just kind of like concant, what I've learned about how Republicans do business, and that will be, for liberals, right? But I had 2 big projects, and one I think I'm going to wait. I think I need 20 years more kind of wisdom and knowledge to do, and it'll cover the sweep of American history, and it'll be about why America has traditionally been in such denial about the level of conflict, that's kind of built into American society, and how consensus ideology is, how important it is to American politics. But I think first I want to write a book about, so I'm very into Karl Polanyi. So Karl Polanyi was an Austrian sociologist and social theorist who wrote a book about the Great Transformation. And basically he has a whole self-contained theory of how pre-market society became market society. And it's a very devastating critique of basically what he calls, because that's what it's called then, liberalism, but what we call libertarianism, and the idea that markets are the natural way to organize society. And he has a historical account of how violent and how political turning, say, the English countryside into a place of where people were forced to enter into wage labor was. And the most exciting part of that book, I think, is the 1830s, when industrialism really is kind of spreading around the world. And so I want to write kind of a historical book about the 1830s that kind of like talks about all these really fascinating kind of revolutions that were kind of happening around the world around the introduction of market economics and industrialism into all sorts of different societies. 1830s was when the Trail of Tears was, the Chartist movement in England, which was really the first kind of big working class political movement. There was a famine in Japan because of the overturning of traditional, farming relations. So it's basically I call it like the guns, germs, and steel for 1830s industrialism. That'll be maybe a 500 or 600 page book, but it'll probably take 5 years to do.
I got my hair cut yesterday, finally, after 5 months. I was in a barber shop here in Astoria, and I heard all the barbers were arguing. They were arguing politics with each other, and one of them, just had the very his view on everything was that that nothing can change because that's how things are. And I think that there's just this failure for people to imagine that there are any systems outside of market systems or outside of capitalism.
Yes, and that's going to be the kind of the programmatic aim of that book will be to basically understand where capitalism comes from. Polanyi is basically an alternative to Karl Marx without the kind of mystical mumbo jumbo about, capitalism ending, because of the contradictions between classes, and it really points the way to a society which we're a lot more mindful of kind of creating just and equitable relationships while recognizing, kind of the reality of markets. Because it's really basically the way markets work is they tend to go in one direction. Once the society, has that kind of loss of innocence, it's very hard to kind of you can decommoditize spheres of life, which, that's what European social democracy does. It kind of says, wow, well, basically medical care is not going to be a place where it's going to be social. It's not going to be capitalistic. So you can do that, but you can't kind of turn a market society into a non-market society. But you can make markets work in ways that create more well-being for everyone.
I think one of your biggest strengths as a writer is taking historical material and making it incredibly engaging, and doing that through a lot of the cultural context and other things. Do you think that you'll be able to use a similar lens when discussing something that's just so economics heavy? I mean, obviously
it's going to be a different kind of book. I'm not going to try and it's not going to be immersive for the reader in the same kind of way. So it'll be a lot more argument based. It'll just have a different mode of address, a different kind of authorial kind of command.
So it's an economics theory book then?
No, it's going to be history.
You do have a central thesis that you're working off of?
Yeah. Basically, when market society intrudes on non-market society, interesting things happen. And
Do you feel like it will be engaging for you in the same way? I mean, obviously, if you're going to commit yourself to writing a 4-part book series of these very thick volumes, absolutely. You have to be into it.
Oh, yeah, totally. It'll be amazing.
When we were setting up the interview, you sent me we were talking about process, and you sent me a clips of you playing jazz piano, which I think perhaps slightly tongue in cheek, saying this is my process. But is there truth to that? Do you feel that being a musician does in some way kind of inform?
Yeah, I mean, like Ronald Reagan said, people said, how can you be the president? You were an actor. And he said, I don't see someone can be president if they haven't been an actor, right? I don't understand how someone can be a writer if they're not a musician. It's all about time, it's all about rhythm, it's all about how to organize tension and resolution. Everything, the ethic that I try and take into the world is based on how I perceive jazz musicians to work in the world. The idea that, life has to be improvisation, but you have to prepare for the improvisation, right? And the importance of kind of, being in the moment, having an ethic of mutuality, and care for one another. And it's got to swing, it's got to, have a propulsive energy to it. And when it comes to writing prose, writing is mind control. It's like you are telling someone what to think at a certain moment, what to feel at a certain moment. And that idea of kind of suspending time in someone else's head is precisely what a musician does. There are 3-4 sentences, there are 4-4 sentences, long sentences, short sentences, long phrases, short phrases, dense passages, airy passages, singing passages, it's just, to me, it's all about music.